Hello, my name is Jeff Montgomery, and I will be presenting today ISS Payload Operations Training during the COVID-19 pandemic, Impacts and Solutions. The COVID-19 pandemic brought about a dramatic and rapid transformation to almost every aspect of humanity in 2020. Mission support teams, especially for complex and crewed missions like the International Space Station, were forced to rethink how Control Center staff performed vital work. Flight controllers and engineers at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, are responsible for operating payload support equipment, data and video systems on board ISS, as well as complex ground control and distribution networks since 2001. We coordinate with the Mission Control Center in Houston and international partners around the globe, supporting the ongoing scientific utilization of the ISS. Operations training prepares crews for their missions, provides training to flight controllers, as well as ensuring new team members are ready to support console operations. When the COVID-19 pandemic was declared March 2020, all United States government facilities were restricted to mission-critical personnel only. For NASA, only essential operations personnel like astronauts, flight controllers, and engineers were authorized to go on site. All other employees, including trainers and trainees, were restricted to working from home using NASA-provided information technology assets. Previously, flight controllers sat near each other. Now they were socially distanced by 6 feet or more. This was accomplished by leaving open seats in between console positions, moving some controllers to alternate rooms, and having other controllers operate remotely from home using secure virtual private network technology. Using widely dispersed prime flight controllers in non-government facilities was a first for human spaceflight operations. Pandemic protocols included sanitizing workstations at the start and end of every shift. NASA provided face masks, hand sanitizer, and disinfectant wipes. Personnel maintained social distancing during their shifts, even in the hallways. If anyone was potentially exposed to the virus, this was reported, and a 14-day home quarantine was implemented. This put pressure on the workforce, as these voluntary quarantines could happen on short notice, and this resulted in finding last-minute replacements for console shifts. Training is an important part of mission operations, and these pandemic protocols created challenges, especially for new trainees. Early in the pandemic, most training was on hold, including simulations and on-the-job training. This essentially stopped trainees from working towards certification. Due to the pandemic, travel to other centers for training was also no longer an option. An additional challenge was the formal tracking of training progress. How to implement secure e-signature documents in standardized NASA-approved format had to be addressed. These training challenges had a real and immediate impact. As shown in this chart, the number of certifications from January through May 2020 dropped dramatically. After standing down training for a month, it was time to move from reaction mode to planning mode in order to restart critical training. This took on increased importance as certified cadre members began to feel the impacts of COVID. We had to ensure certified personnel were available to continue 24/7 operations. In April 2020, the Marshall Space Flight Center Training Panel held a strategy meeting to identify needs for training emphasis. These included identifying trainees who are closest to certification, determining how or if existing training can be done remotely, and identifying training that must be done in person, as well as the steps required to meet NASA COVID restrictions. Priorities for flight control training were identified as well. The highest priority was Phase 2 training, to finish certifications for console positions where training was almost complete. Second priority was Phase 1 training. This is initial training for new employees, and once this is completed, trainees move into Phase 2 training. The third priority was Phase 3 training. This is currency and proficiency training for certified cadre members. This training needed to be made available remotely as the pandemic continued. We also saw the need to not just maintain regular communication between trainers and trainees, but to enhance it. Microsoft Teams proved to be an indispensable tool. The audio-visual capabilities, screen sharing, and chat features made it easy to transition from face-to-face meetings to virtual meetings. Trainers used Microsoft Teams to augment training by conducting trainer-to-trainee meetings, classroom lessons, roundtable sessions, oral evaluations, simulation and real-time flight following, as well as sim planning group and training panel meetings. Chat capabilities allowed trainers and trainees to continue informal training that would normally occur in the office. Virtual person-to-person contact has been critical in moving training forward to completion during the pandemic. One surprise that came out of this was how the GIF feature in chat has helped to build camaraderie with new employees. One of our staff instructional designers has experience developing and delivering remote training at the university level. She used her expertise to write a guide on facilitating remote learning to help our instructors learn the nuances of remote instruction. Training integration also helped to optimize existing lessons for remote delivery. Virtual classroom capabilities created included desktop sharing to show presentations, video, and voice loop audio, using the raise hand feature to ask questions, video sharing for new trainees to meet one another, and using the chat features for discussion as well as for asking and responding to questions. Lessons learned were applied to roundtables used for training and knowledge assessment. Because face-to-face was not an option, roundtables were moved to the Microsoft Teams video and chat function format. This allowed trainees and trainers to conduct scenarios and assess understanding. Early in the pandemic, simulations were identified as a critical training need to prepare trainees for performance OJT and eventual certification. Simulations exercise critical soft skills and provide technical training that is not possible in a real-time environment. In late March 2020, the Sim Planning Group met to discuss ways to conduct remote simulations. An immediate challenge was Payload Control Area 2, PCA2, normally used for simulation training, was not available. Early in the COVID response, PCA2 was reserved as a hot backup in the event PCA1, the Prime Payload Operations Control Center, needed to be disinfected. Thus, the group had to identify limitations of being fully remote. And these limitations included inability to have over-the-wall conversations, lack of eye contact and other nonverbal cues, no access to consoles used to monitor payload systems, limited access to normally used communication loops, simulation payload-operated video would not be available, and latency and data quality issues due to different home internet capabilities would have to be addressed. ISS simulation servers were not used because it was considered unreasonable for trainees to view data on their laptop monitors instead of the multiple console displays. This meant trainees would not have access to fault summary and other software tools that increase situational awareness. Malfunction cases were introduced to the cadre via green card, for telemetry items, or by calls on the loops for crew call-downs or reports to the flight director. The second step was identifying achievable training objectives in this constrained simulation environment. These included practicing failure impact workaround methodology in response to events, exercising voice loop protocol, practicing situational awareness, using applicable flight rules, procedures, and other mission documentation, and executing the simulation timeline. The first remote simulation occurred April 16, 2020, and the trainees successfully coordinated and executed nominal timeline activities, as well as exercised many team skill elements. Non-commanding positions achieved most of their planned objectives. However, not having simulated data had a negative impact on commanding positions. Without displays, they relied on surrogate descriptions of messages and displays to determine malfunctions. Commanding trainees also could not practice performing nominal commanding tasks. Due to the mixed results, the SIM team investigated how to resume in-person simulations. In consultation with training leads and senior management, the following requirements were identified. Provide social distancing spacing for trainees, surrogates, and the SIM team. Provide personal protective equipment and cleaning supplies. Locate other areas on site that could support a control console with an iVOD's voice unit, since PCA2 use was restricted. Identify walking paths for simulation participants that are clear from areas used by real-time operations. Coordinate with real-time support to ensure rooms used for simulations did not impact real-time operations. And conduct debriefs over the loops because of social distancing constraints. Despite having trainees spread across several rooms, the first in-person simulation was deemed highly successful. And by June 2020, as NASA's COVID response was proving to be effective, PCA2 was made available to support training. While we could not have the entire cadre of trainers in there at one time due to social distancing constraints, it did allow us to co-locate many positions together. This allowed the trainees to practice using team skills based on nonverbal cues and over-the-wall conversations. As of today, POIC is continuing to successfully execute simulations based on this COVID-19 response protocol. The team's dedication and adherence to the NASA COVID guidelines has enabled us to safely resume training and continue 24/7 ISS payload operations. As a result, trainee certifications increased from May through December 2020. The December drop-off you see here is expected due to the holiday season. All of this helped us ensure having an adequate number of certified flight controllers to support 24/7 payload operations. Astronaut training for ISS payloads operations was also impacted by COVID. Virtual learning was used to minimize flight crew and instructor contact for hardware demonstration lessons. The crew member was able to remotely watch and listen via video feed as the instructor handled hardware while pointing out key information. At times, we had the crew perform hands-on operations with the hardware. While watching a video feed, the instructor explained detailed operations while the crew was following instruction via audio. This provided a good learning experience for the crew, similar to some on-orbit operations. One notable exception, when training the crew on detailed scientific tasks like dissections or plant sampling, there simply is no substitute for hands-on instructor-guided training in those cases. Schedule constraints was another challenge, as astronaut crews had less time for training due to post-travel quarantine requirements. Sometimes the only way to stay on schedule was to use remote learning while in quarantine. Another challenge was the reduced number of people involved and increasing the instructor workload because of that. During the pandemic, to minimize in-person participants, the instructors were tasked with teaching, facilitating, and completing the training reports. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Marshall Space Flight Center operations trainers found new ways to continue training astronauts and POIC controllers during the pandemic. This included prioritizing training, adapting to remote training with Microsoft Teams, efficiently coordinating between training team and management, adapting in-person simulations in OJT, and creating variations of remote astronaut training. When the pandemic is over and NASA considers all of the lessons learned from the COVID-19 era, we predict many of the efficiencies gained from virtual training will be retained. However, it must be noted, there is no substitute for operators or astronauts gaining experience with the actual complex systems they will use in mission support. Thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.